The wreckage lay 15 feet beneath the crystal-clear waters of the Bahamas, its gleaming white hull now a tomb of broken dreams and shattered aluminum. When the Coast Guard divers first descended to examine what remained of Serendipity, a pristine 42-foot Catalina that had cost more than most people's houses, they expected to find evidence of collision, storm damage, or perhaps human error. What they discovered instead would send shockwaves through the sailing community and forever change how maritime investigators approach seemingly impossible disasters. This isn't just another tale of the sea claiming what man thought he could master. This is the story of how the smallest oversight can cascade into the largest catastrophe, how a component that costs less than a nice dinner can sink a vessel worth more than most people earn in 5 years. It's a story that will make you question everything you think you know about sailing safety, about the reliability of modern marine engineering, and about the deadly arrogance of assuming that expensive equals safe. The investigation that followed would uncover a chain of events so improbable, so perfectly orchestrated by fate and physics, that even the most experienced marine accident investigators initially refused to believe it. But the evidence was undeniable, the physics were sound, and the lesson was as brutal as it was simple. In the unforgiving world of offshore sailing, it's not the monster waves or howling winds that will kill you. It's the thing you never saw coming. The detail so small you never thought to check it. The assumption so basic you never thought to question it. What you're about to discover will change how you think about every boat you've ever stepped aboard. The diary entries, radio transmissions, and forensic evidence will examine piece by piece, will reveal not just how Serendipity met her end, but why this disaster was both completely preventable and absolutely inevitable. This is a story that every sailor needs to hear, every boat owner needs to understand, and every person who trusts their life to the sea needs to remember. Because what happened to Robert and Linda Garrison on that impossibly calm February morning could happen to anyone who makes the same fatal assumption they did. Robert "Bobby" Garrison had salt water in his veins long before he ever set foot on his first boat. At 62, the retired aerospace engineer from San Diego possessed the kind of methodical precision that had helped design components for military aircraft, combined with a passion for sailing that bordered on obsession. His wife Linda, 58, had been a successful pediatric nurse practitioner before retirement, known for her attention to detail and her ability to remain calm under pressure, qualities that had made her an excellent sailing partner for over 3 decades. The Garrisons weren't weekend warriors or fair-weather sailors. They'd been cruising together since 1991, starting with a modest 28-foot Bristol that they'd sailed throughout the Pacific coast. Over the years, they'd graduated to larger vessels, each one representing not just increased comfort, but increased capability. They'd weathered gales off Point Conception, navigated the treacherous waters around Cape Mendocino, and completed multiple passages to Hawaii. Their logbooks read like a masterclass in progressive sailing experience, each entry meticulously recorded in Bobby's engineer's handwriting. Serendipity represented the culmination of everything they'd learned and saved for over 30 years of marriage. The 2019 Catalina 425 had cost them $310,000 new, a sum that represented Bobby's entire retirement account and Linda's inheritance from her mother's estate. But she wasn't just expensive, she was their ticket to the dream that had sustained them through decades of 12-hour workdays and delayed gratification. The plan was elegantly simple. Spend 2 years exploring the Caribbean, then continue through the Panama Canal to the South Pacific. They'd mapped out anchorages from Trinidad to Tahiti, researched visa requirements for a dozen countries, and calculated provisioning needs down to the last can of beans. Bobby had even learned basic diesel mechanics and electronics repair, while Linda had taken advanced first aid courses and studied celestial navigation. They were as prepared as any cruising couple could be. The boat itself was a testament to modern sailing technology and safety. The Catalina 425 was no experimental design. It was a proven offshore cruiser with hundreds of sister ships sailing around the world. Her hull was solid fiberglass, her rigging was sized for ocean passages, and her safety equipment list read like a Coast Guard inspection manual. Bobby had added every conceivable upgrade: a water maker, wind generator, solar panels, radar, chart plotter, satellite communicator, life raft, EPIRB, and enough safety equipment to stock a small chandlery. They'd spent 18 months retrofitting Serendipity for offshore cruising, much of it in Bobby's own hands. Every through hull had been inspected and serviced. Every piece of rigging had been examined with a magnifying glass. The engine had been completely serviced, the sails professionally inspected, and the electronics meticulously tested. Linda had organized the interior with the efficiency of a military quartermaster, every item secured and inventoried. Their friends joked that Serendipity was more thoroughly prepared than most Coast Guard vessels. The departure from San Diego in October had been picture perfect, with dozens of friends from the yacht club gathered to send them off on their dream cruise. The passage to Cabo San Lucas was flawless, then north to La Paz, where they spent Christmas exploring the Sea of Cortez. January found them in Puerto Vallarta, making final preparations for the long passage to the Caribbean via the Panama Canal. Their first ocean crossing was a textbook example of passage making, 23 days from Puerto Vallarta to the Panama Canal, with steady trade winds, moderate seas, and not a single significant problem. Bobby's daily log entries documented their progress with engineering precision, wind speed and direction, barometric pressure, sail configuration, engine hours, position fixes. Linda's parallel journal captured the emotional journey. Dolphins at dawn, spectacular sunsets, the profound peace of being truly alone with the sea. The transit through the Panama Canal in early February was equally smooth, with Serendipity handled like the thoroughbred she was designed to be. They'd celebrated their successful Atlantic crossing at the Shelter Bay Marina, toasting their achievement with a bottle of champagne they'd been saving for the occasion. After 3 decades of dreaming and planning, they were finally living the cruising life they'd worked so hard to achieve. February 15th found them anchored in the pristine waters of the San Blas Islands, a chain of Caribbean paradises off the coast of Panama. The weather was perfect. Light winds, calm seas, and the kind of crystalline visibility that makes the Caribbean famous. They'd been exploring the islands for a week, snorkeling over coral reefs, trading with the local Kuna people, and generally living the tropical dream that adorned a 1000 sailing magazine. Bobby's log entry for February 15th recorded conditions that would have made any sailor smile. Wind light and variable, seas calm, barometer steady at 30-15 and rising. Perfect weather for exploring the outer islands, water clarity exceptional, can see the anchor at 25 feet. Linda spotted a nurse shark this morning, completely docile. This is what we dreamed about all those years. Linda's journal entry was equally optimistic. Woke up to another perfect day in paradise. The water is so clear it's like floating in air. Bobby is in full engineering mode, checking and rechecking everything as usual. Sometimes I think he trusts his checklists more than he trusts the boat, but I love how thorough he is. It's what's kept us safe all these years. Their routine that morning was identical to hundreds of others they'd performed during their cruising career. Bobby woke at dawn to check the anchor, scan the horizon, and examine the weather forecast on their satellite receiver. Linda prepared coffee and started reviewing their charts for the day's intended anchorage. Everything was routine, methodical, safe. At 9:30 a.m., Bobby started the engine to charge the batteries, a daily ritual as regular as morning coffee. Serendipities. Yanmar 54 horsepower diesel fired immediately, settling into the steady rumble that had become the soundtrack of their cruising life. Bobby let it warm up for 5 minutes, then engaged the transmission to check the prop shaft, while Linda secured items below for their planned move to a different anchorage. The engine ran perfectly for 37 minutes. Bobby noted the time in his log, 1007 hours, engine running normally, oil pressure 45 psi, water temperature 180 degrees, alternator charging at 14.2 volts. These were the last words Robert Garrison would ever write. At 10:07 a.m., Serendipity began to die. It started with a sound that Bobby would later describe to investigators as like someone stepping on a paper bag, a small, almost insignificant pop that came from somewhere deep in the engine compartment. The sound was so subtle that Linda, who was organizing the V-berth 20 feet away, didn't even hear it. Bobby noticed it, but only barely. The kind of sound that registers just enough to make you pause and listen for a moment before dismissing it as nothing important. The engine continued running normally. All the gauges read exactly as they should. The steady rumble of the diesel was unchanged. The prop shaft continued turning smoothly, and the alternator kept charging the batteries. For exactly 93 seconds, nothing seemed wrong. Then Linda noticed the smell. It was subtle at first, just a faint odor that seemed slightly out of place in the normal cocktail of diesel fumes, bilge water, and salt air that pervades every cruising boat. She paused in her packing, sniffed the air, and tried to identify what seemed different. It wasn't the acrid smell of electrical burning, or the sharp tang of overheating metal, or the distinctive reek of a fuel leak. It was something else. Something that took her several seconds to identify. It smelled like hot metal and seawater. "Bobby!" she called from below. "Do you smell something?" Bobby was in the cockpit, scanning the horizon with binoculars and mentally plotting their route to the next anchorage. "Smell what?" he called back, not really paying attention. The engine was running smoothly, all the instruments were normal, and his attention was focused on the reef system they'd need to navigate. "I'm not sure," Linda replied, moving toward the engine compartment. "Something smells hot." That got Bobby's attention. In 30 years of sailing together, Linda's nose had saved them from problems more times than he could count. She'd detected an overheating transmission bearing in Mexico, smelled electrical problems that instruments hadn't yet detected, and once identified a propane leak that could have killed them both. When Linda said something smelled wrong, Bobby listened. He shut down the engine immediately and joined her at the engine compartment hatch. The Yanmar was ticking softly as it cooled, and everything appeared normal. Oil level good, coolant level good, no obvious leaks, no unusual sounds. The engine room was spotless. Bobby maintained it with the same obsessive care he brought to everything mechanical. "Maybe it was just something on the wind," Linda said, but she didn't sound convinced. Bobby ran through his standard engine checks anyway. Oil pressure had been normal when he shut down. Water temperature had been steady at 180 degrees. The raw water strainer was clear, the drive belt was properly tensioned, and the exhaust system showed no signs of problems. Every visible component looked exactly as it should. "Everything looks fine," he announced, wiping his hands on a shop rag. "Maybe some kelp got sucked into the raw water intake. I'll start her up again, and we'll monitor things closely." The engine fired immediately, settling back into its familiar rhythm. Bobby watched the gauges like a hawk, while Linda positioned herself near the engine compartment, ready to call out any unusual sights, sounds, or smells. For 5 minutes, everything appeared completely normal. Then the water started coming in. It began as just a trickle, barely visible in the maze of hoses, wires, and mechanical components that filled the engine compartment. Linda noticed it first, a tiny stream of water that caught the light from the overhead LED fixture. She pointed it out to Bobby, who immediately shut down the engine and grabbed a flashlight. The leak was coming from the raw water side of the engine cooling system, somewhere in the area of the heat exchanger. Bobby traced the trickle to its source, a small crack in what appeared to be a bronze through-hull fitting that connected the raw water cooling system to the sea. The crack was hairline thin, barely visible even with the flashlight, but seawater was definitely seeping through. "It's not too bad," Bobby announced, his engineer's mind already working on solutions. "Looks like a stress crack in the through hull. I can probably clamp it temporarily and we can make it to Colon for proper repairs." This was exactly the kind of problem that experienced cruisers deal with regularly. Through hull fittings crack, hoses fail, pumps break down. It's all part of the offshore sailing experience. Bobby and Linda had dealt with similar issues dozens of times over the years. The boat carried extensive spares, multiple repair methods, and the experience to handle almost any mechanical problem. Bobby retrieved his toolkit and began fashioning a temporary repair. He wrapped the cracked fitting with several layers of waterproof tape, then secured a hose clamp over the tape to distribute the pressure. It was a textbook temporary fix, the kind of repair that had kept cruising boats running for decades. The repair seemed to work perfectly. The leak stopped immediately, and Bobby felt satisfied that they could safely motor the 40 miles to Colon, where permanent repairs could be made. He started the engine again, watched the repair carefully for several minutes, and saw no signs of continued leaking. "Problem solved," he announced with the confidence of an engineer who'd spent his career troubleshooting complex systems. "We'll take it easy on the way to Colon, run the engine conservatively, and have it properly repaired when we get there." Linda felt the familiar relief that came with Bobby's methodical approach to boat problems. In 30 years of cruising, his careful, systematic troubleshooting had never failed them. She trusted his engineering skills completely, and his track record justified that trust. They raised the anchor and began motoring slowly toward Colon, taking their time and keeping a careful eye on the temporary repair. The engine ran smoothly, the makeshift clamp held perfectly, and their GPS showed they'd reached the marina well before dark. It seemed like just another minor adventure in their cruising life, The kind of story they'd tell other sailors over sundowners. For 38 minutes, everything went according to plan. At 11:43 a.m., the temporary repair failed catastrophically. It didn't fail gradually, with slowly increasing leakage that would have given them time to react. Instead, the entire through-hull fitting separated from the hull in a single explosive failure that instantly opened a hole the size of a golf ball directly into the Caribbean Sea. The sound was unmistakable, the roar of water under pressure rushing into spaces where it had no business being. Bobby immediately shut down the engine and raced below, but he could see instantly that this was far beyond any temporary repair. Water was pouring into the engine compartment at a rate that made their bilge pump seem like a toy. "Linda!" he shouted. "Get on the radio! Mayday, mayday, mayday!" Linda grabbed the VHF microphone with hands that were remarkably steady considering the circumstances. "Mayday, mayday, mayday! This is sailing vessel Serendipity. Sailing vessel Serendipity. We are taking on water rapidly and require immediate assistance." The Coast Guard station in Colon responded within seconds, but their nearest vessel was over 2 hours away. Bobby was already attacking the leak with every method he knew: wooden plugs, expanding foam, underwater epoxy, emergency patches. Nothing worked. The hole was too large, the water pressure too great, and the location too inaccessible for effective repair. Serendipity was sinking. The next 27 minutes were a masterclass in emergency seamanship. Bobby and Linda executed their abandoned ship procedures with the precision of a drill they'd practiced but never hoped to use. Life jackets, emergency beacon, grab bag with documents and emergency supplies, life raft deployment, everything they'd rehearsed for 3 decades but never actually needed. The life raft inflated perfectly. Their emergency beacon began transmitting their position, and their handheld VHF maintained contact with the Coast Guard. They abandoned Serendipity with the professionalism of experienced sailors who knew that boats can be replaced, but lives cannot. Serendipity slipped beneath the surface 43 minutes after the through-hull failure, settling to the bottom in 28 feet of crystal clear water. The garrisons watched from their life raft as 30 years of dreams and their entire life savings disappeared into the Caribbean, leaving only an oil slick and floating debris to mark where their floating home had been. The Coast Guard helicopter arrived 16 minutes later, hoisting Bobby and Linda to safety with nothing more than the clothes on their backs and the contents of their emergency bag. They were shaken but uninjured, grateful to be alive, but devastated by the loss of everything they'd worked toward for 3 decades. The preliminary investigation began immediately. Coast Guard investigators interviewed the garrisons extensively, documented the accident scene, and began the process of determining what had caused a modern, well-maintained sailboat to sink in perfect weather conditions. The initial assumption was that the through-hull failure was the primary cause, a straightforward case of equipment failure leading to catastrophic flooding. But maritime accident investigator Sarah Chen wasn't satisfied with straightforward explanations. A former Navy engineer with 15 years of experience investigating marine casualties, Chen had seen too many cases where the obvious cause masked a deeper, more troubling reality. The physics of the Serendipity sinking didn't quite add up in her mind. "The timeline bothers me," she told her colleague during their initial case review. "A golf ball-sized hole shouldn't sink a 42-foot sailboat that quickly. Not with multiple bulkheads and compartmentalization. There's something else going on here." Chen's investigation would prove to be one of the most thorough marine accident analyses in Coast Guard history. She ordered the complete recovery of Serendipity's wreckage, arranged for metallurgical analysis of the failed components, and began a painstaking reconstruction of every event leading up to the sinking. The wreckage recovery took 3 days, with Coast Guard divers carefully documenting the position and condition of every component. The boat had settled upright on the sandy bottom, her mast still standing, looking almost ready to sail, except for the gaping hole in her starboard side where the through-hull had failed. The metallurgical analysis revealed the first clue to the real cause of the disaster. The through-hull fitting that had failed wasn't bronze, as Bobby had assumed. It was brass. More specifically, it was a brass fitting that had been manufactured with a high zinc content, making it susceptible to a form of corrosion called dezincification. Dezincification is the insidious form of brass corrosion where the zinc component of the alloy is selectively leached out by seawater. leaving behind a weak, porous structure that looks normal but has lost most of its structural strength. The process is invisible from the outside, turning sound brass into what metallurgists call pink rot, a weak, brittle material that can fail without warning. But even dezincification didn't fully explain the catastrophic nature of the failure. Brass-through hulls fail regularly in marine environments, usually developing small leaks that can be managed until repairs are made. The complete explosive failure of the Serendipity fitting was unusual even for severely corroded brass. The answer came from the boat's maintenance records, which Bobby had meticulously maintained in both paper and electronic form. The through-hull fitting in question had been installed during the boat's original construction in 2019, but it had been replaced during Bobby's extensive refit in 2023. The replacement part had cost $97 and was listed in Bobby's records as bronze through-hull, 1.5-inch. But the receipt revealed a crucial detail that Bobby had missed. The part number indicated it was actually a brass fitting that had been bronze-plated to look like solid bronze. It was a common cost-cutting measure in marine hardware manufacturing, creating a product that appeared to be high-quality bronze, but was actually susceptible brass underneath a thin protective coating. Chen's investigation revealed that the bronze plating had been damaged during installation, possibly by over-tightening or cross-threading during Bobby's meticulous refit. The damage was microscopic, invisible to visual inspection, but it allowed seawater to reach the brass substrate and begin the dezincification process. Over the 18 months since installation, the fitting had been slowly weakening as the zinc was leached from the brass alloy. The process accelerated in the warm Caribbean waters, which provided ideal conditions for the electrochemical reactions that drive dezincification. By the time of the accident, the fitting retained less than 30% of its original strength. The final piece of the puzzle was the paper bag sound that Bobby had heard just before the leak began. Chen's analysis suggested that this was the sound of the through-hull fitting beginning to separate from the hull as the dezincification reached a critical threshold. The 93 seconds between the sound and the appearance of the leak was the time it took for the crack to propagate through the remaining sound metal. The catastrophic failure occurred when the engine vibration, combined with the thermal expansion from normal operating temperatures, created enough stress to complete the separation. The entire fitting didn't just crack. It was ejected from the hull like a cork from a champagne bottle, creating the golf ball-sized hole that sank Serendipity. But Chen's investigation revealed an even more disturbing truth. The failure was entirely predictable and completely preventable. A simple ultrasonic inspection of the through-hull fittings during routine maintenance would have detected the dezincification long before it reached dangerous levels. A basic understanding of brass corrosion in marine environments would have prompted replacement of the suspect fitting years before failure. The real tragedy wasn't that Bobby and Linda had lost their boat and their dreams. It was that they'd lost them to a problem that any competent marine surveyor would have identified and corrected for less than the cost of a nice dinner. The $97 brass fitting that sank Serendipity was a textbook example of the nautical axiom that the most expensive equipment is often the least critical, while the cheapest components can be the most dangerous. Bobby had spent thousands of dollars on safety equipment, navigation electronics, and redundant systems, but he'd been undone by a piece of hardware that cost less than most people spend on lunch. Chen's final report became required reading at the Coast Guard Academy and was distributed to marine surveyors throughout the industry. Her conclusions were stark and uncompromising. The loss of Serendipity was caused by the installation of substandard hardware that was misrepresented as a superior product. The owner, despite extensive experience and careful maintenance practices, was unable to detect the problem because the failure mode was invisible to normal inspection methods. This accident represents a systemic failure of marine hardware standards and consumer protection in the marine industry. And the report's recommendations led to significant changes in marine hardware regulations, requiring clearer labeling of metal alloys and mandating ultrasonic inspection of critical through-hull fittings during insurance surveys. But for Bobby and Linda Garrison, These changes came too late. The insurance settlement provided enough money to purchase another boat, but the psychological impact of losing everything they'd worked for to such a trivial cause was devastating. Bobby became obsessed with metallurgy and corrosion science, spending hours researching the failure modes of marine hardware. Linda suffered nightmares about sinking boats for months after the accident. They eventually purchased a smaller boat and resumed cruising, but their relationship with the sea had been fundamentally changed. The easy confidence that had sustained them through 3 decades of sailing was gone, replaced by a hypervigilance about every component, every system, every potential failure mode. "It's not the same," Linda wrote in her journal 6 months after the accident. "We used to trust the boat completely, trust our preparation, trust our experience. Now we question everything." Bobby spends an hour every morning just looking at things, checking things we've checked 100 times before. The joy is still there, but it's mixed with something else now, a knowledge of how quickly everything can disappear. Bobby's response was characteristically systematic. He developed what he called the Serendipity Protocol, a comprehensive inspection routine that included ultrasonic testing of all through-hull fittings, metallurgical analysis of critical hardware, and electrochemical corrosion monitoring. It was thorough, scientific, and completely impractical for most cruising sailors. "The thing that haunts me," Bobby told a gathering of fellow sailors at a cruisers seminar, "is that I did everything right, except for the one thing that mattered. I checked every system, inspected every component, and tested every piece of equipment. But I trusted a piece of paper that told me I was buying bronze, when I was actually buying brass with a bronze coating. I was undone by a lie that was printed on a receipt." The broader implications of the serendipity disaster extend far beyond a single boat or a single family's dream. The accident revealed systemic problems in marine hardware manufacturing, where cost-cutting measures and misleading marketing create dangerous situations for unsuspecting boat owners. It highlighted the limitations of traditional marine surveys, which rely heavily on visual inspection and may miss corrosion that's hidden beneath surface treatments. Most importantly, it demonstrated the deadly potential of complacency in marine safety. Bobby and Linda were experienced, careful, well-prepared sailors who did everything right, according to conventional wisdom. They were undone not by inexperience or negligence, but by a failure mode so obscure that even experienced marine professionals might not have detected it. The marine industry's response to the serendipity investigation was mixed. Progressive manufacturers began using better alloys and improved labeling, while some traditionalists argued that experienced sailors should have known better than to trust unmarked hardware. Insurance companies began requiring more thorough surveys, and some began offering discounts for boats that underwent ultrasonic through-hull inspection. But for every positive change inspired by Serendipity's loss, there remained dozens of boats with similar time bombs hidden in their hulls. The brass through-hull fittings that caused the disaster were installed in thousands of boats during the same time period, and many of them remain undetected and uninspected. Sarah Chen's follow-up research identified at least 47 other marine casualties that showed similar failure patterns, suggesting that the Serendipity disaster was not an isolated incident, but part of a much larger problem. Her work led to congressional hearings on marine hardware standards and ultimately to new federal regulations governing the labeling and composition of critical marine components. The human cost of these regulatory changes can be measured in lives saved and disasters prevented, but it came too late for the hundreds of boat owners who had already installed the problematic hardware. The marine insurance industry estimated that bronze-plated brass fittings were responsible for over $50 million in boat losses between 2018 and 2025, with Serendipity being just the most thoroughly documented case. Today, Bobby and Linda continue cruising, but their new boat is a testament to hard-won wisdom. Every through-hull fitting has been replaced with certified bronze components that have been independently verified by metallurgical analysis. Every piece of hardware has been researched, tested, and documented. Their current boat may not be as elegant as Serendipity, but it represents a level of paranoia that their former confidence never achieved. The irony is not lost on either of them. Their first boat was sunk by trust. Trust in manufacturers, trust in labeling, trust in the assumption that expensive boats come with quality components. Their current boat is kept afloat by suspicion. Suspicion of every component, every claim, every assumption about marine hardware. We're better sailors now, Linda reflects. But I'm not sure we're happier sailors. We know too much about what can go wrong, about how the smallest things can destroy everything you've worked for. Sometimes I envy the people who can just trust their boats and enjoy the sailing without constantly worrying about failure modes they can't see. Bobby's perspective is characteristically analytical. The ocean doesn't care about your experience, your preparation, or how much money you've spent. It only cares about the weakest link in your system. Our weakest link was a $97 piece of brass that we thought was bronze. Now we make sure we know exactly what every component is made of, where it came from, and how it's likely to fail. Indeed, the Serendipity disaster stands as a permanent reminder that in the unforgiving environment of offshore sailing, paranoia is not a character flaw, but a survival trait. The difference between coming home and not coming home can be as small as the difference between bronze and brass, as subtle as the difference between what something appears to be and what it actually is. For the thousands of sailors who have read Sarah Chen's investigation report, the lesson is clear. Never trust your life to anything you haven't personally verified. The sea is patient, methodical, and utterly ruthless in exploiting the smallest weakness. It doesn't matter if that weakness costs $97 or $97,000. If it can fail, it will fail, and usually at the worst possible moment. The ocean doesn't negotiate, doesn't accept excuses, and doesn't offer second chances. In the end, Serendipity was sunk not by the sea, but by the deadly assumption that someone else had done their job properly. It's a lesson that no sailor can afford to ignore, and one that Bobby and Linda Garrison paid for with everything they owned and 30 years of dreams. The wreckage of Serendipity still lies on the bottom of the Caribbean, her mast reaching toward the surface like a monument to the dangers of misplaced trust. Occasionally, sport divers visit the site, marveling at how intact and beautiful the boat still appears. Most never realize that they're looking at the grave of dreams killed by a lie that cost $97 and the trust of people who deserved better. That's the real tragedy of the Serendipity disaster. Not that it happened, but that it was so easily preventable. All it would have taken was one person, anywhere in the chain from manufacturer to retailer to installer, who cared enough to tell the truth about what they were selling. Instead, Bobby and Linda Garrison lost everything they'd worked for because they trusted a piece of paper that called brass, bronze. In the end, the sea claimed another boat, another dream, another reminder that in the world of offshore sailing, there is no such thing as a small detail. Everything matters. Nothing can be taken for granted, and the price of assumption is always higher than anyone wants to pay. The lesson of Serendipity is simple, brutal, and absolute. Trust nothing, verify everything, and remember that the ocean is always looking for the one thing you didn't check, the one component you didn't question, the one assumption you didn't challenge. Because when it finds that weakness, it won't hesitate to use it.